Well, hello there, and thank you for joining another episode of The Art of Feminine Negotiation. I'm your host, Cindy Watson, and I am really glad you're here and can't wait for you to hear today's episode. Just before we dive in, though, I want to make sure you're aware of a few ways that we can work together if you're looking to uplevel your negotiation skills, because I've got everything from one-on-one to VIP to group or online programs available if you're looking to better leverage your innate power to get more of what you want and deserve in life. If that sounds interesting, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. And now, the reason that you are here, it is my great pleasure to introduce you today to Karen Laos. We're going to be talking about how to transform self-doubt to self-confidence to get better negotiated outcomes. So welcome, Karen. I'm so excited to have you here.
And I love that. Better negotiating outcomes. Yes. And
I just, for our listeners, I had to have Karen here. When I saw her bio and the work that she's doing, you will quickly see why it totally resonated with me. Definitely parallel paths and great messaging. So get a pad and paper, get ready to take some notes here. I think there are going to be all kinds of gold nuggets dropping from the ceiling. And for those of you who don't know Karen Laos is a communication expert and a confidence cultivator, which I love that term. That really captured me. And she's fiercely committed to her mission to eradicate self-doubt, which really plagues us, and women in particular, I think, suffer from that. And she gives women practical strategies to ask for what they want in the boardroom and beyond. So, you know, that resonates with me. I always talk about from the boardroom to the bedroom.
yes.
With 25 years serving as a C-suite advisor and commanding some of the most coveted stages around the world, we're talking Google and Starbucks and even NASA, Karen's been leading the front line of best practices for creating results through confident communication. We can all use that. She is the author of Trust Your Own Voice, Growing Your Influence Through Confident Communication, and the host of her own highly ranked podcast called Ignite Your Confidence. So, Karen, I read once, it cracked me up that you first negotiated the power of confident communication when you successfully negotiated a flea market purchase. I think you were, what, 6 years old or something?
Yes. Exactly. My dad gave me a few dollars at the flea market and he said, go have fun, but never pay full price.
Oh my gosh. Smart advice.
I know. And he left me to figure that out.
That was so awesome. Now, do you think that had impact? Is that one of the reasons you came to this line of work, or?
I would say that, yes, I have never been afraid to ask.
Yeah.
And that is a real strength of mine. And I feel like I can't put that out into the world without saying that juxtaposed with that was a very traditional upbringing with a mom who was a homemaker, 9 kids. And she taught me through modeling that my voice wasn't important unless a man said it was.
Wow.
So it was very interesting to have this dynamic growing up. And one of the things that I find fascinating, and the more I do this work, and maybe this is similar to you too, the more I realize this is not a story that is that unique. Yes. Meaning the moms who traditionally would do what the dad said, and that's the way that I, again, grew up. But what I realized and how I've now reconciled this, and as through lots of personal growth and therapy and reading, all that stuff, but really recognizing that I realized when I had something that I saw of value, such as something I could accomplish for someone, something to help get someone results. And I know a lot of people, we've all grown up in this production society. What you produce is what determines your value. Yeah. So it was never hard for me to ask or to succeed professionally because of that ability to ask and be out there. Yeah. I always had confidence in my accomplishments. But if you had asked me about my own worth and my value as a person, and this was actually very, very evident in when I was dating my now husband. And I remember coming home after work, and we had a date that night, and I was rattling off all the accomplishments I had that day. And he stopped me very gently and he said, honey, I love that you love your work. That is not why I love you. Oh. I love you just for who you are. Oh. And that was so foreign to me. Yeah. It was hard to believe, and it's still emotional for me today because that was such a powerful shift. Yeah. And I feel like there's a lot of people, not just women, but
Yeah.
people navigating this.
Yeah.
How do I show my worth, but also not be afraid to ask? And also, all the reasons why people don't ask. I don't want to bother somebody. I don't want to put someone out, and all the things.
I love that. What a beautiful gift. And if you don't mind me asking, how do you think you got that voice in a household where what was being modeled was the opposite of that?
That really was my dad's modeling of, you can get whatever you want
Okay.
with enough determination and persistence, and you
Yeah.
have to ask.
Yeah.
And so that's that again, it's hard to sometimes know, well, how did all the pieces fit
Yeah.
together? But because whenever I would ask for something, it was something tangible. And
Yeah.
a therapist challenged me with this once, and he said, "Isn't it interesting, Karen, that you'll have no problem at a hotel saying," because I travel so much,
Yeah.
if there's an issue at a hotel, you have no problem speaking up.
Same.
But when it comes to something about you personally, that's a different story."
Yeah. Oh, so true. I'm glad you raised that, my God. And I'm smiling here because this resonates so much. Because when you said that about the modeling in the household, we had that same sort of dysfunction, if you will, where my dad definitely ruled the roost vis-a-vis my mom. She was the traditional sort of, she was only 16 when she had me. So she was, barely a baby herself. But definitely that control. And yet he had, they had two girls. I'm sure my dad wanted boys. He wanted to teach us to box, but he was very fierce in hindsight. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but making sure we had a voice, spirited debates at the dinner table and asking for what we wanted and voicing our opinion, whatever that was, which was so inconsistent with the relationship that he had with my mother. So that's a really interesting observation. I love that. Now, while we're talking about this sort of feminine and these roles, like the so-called feminine or soft skills, I think have gotten a really bad rap. And I think both men and women have seen them as a liability, which is one of the reasons I think the world's so out of balance today. And I know you've certainly traveled the globe educating industry leaders on how these undervalued skills can impact the bottom line. So I'd love your take on that. Tell us a bit about your thoughts.
Absolutely. The thing that I feel is such an unfortunate moray in our culture is this term soft skills.
Yeah.
Because they are the most tactical, practical things ever.
Absolutely.
And it's so fascinating to me. I've never done any deep research to know, how did we come up with that?
Yeah.
Because what I find fascinating is that we all decide very quickly if we trust and like someone.
Yeah.
And particularly like.
Yeah.
And these things are so obvious. And yet what I also find interesting is that, well, I'll give an example because I think this says it all. An executive vice president at a large company. I better not say that company, but everybody would know the company.
Yeah.
When I was part of a research team really looking into, how do you measure executive presence? And we asked her, how would you define it?
Yeah.
She paused, then she goes, I don't know, but I know it when I see it.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, that is such a common response to how we take someone in. And that is really what I am wanting to fight against. And I shouldn't say fight, but my business is helping people map actual behaviors to things like trust and likability. So a simple example would be simply smiling a little bit more creates likability.
Yeah.
Tone in your voice and all the things that I talk about related to executive presence. But I think what happens is, and part of the problem is, that we use these generic terms like presence, like energy, like passion, but we don't map it to how can you replicate that?
Yeah.
And so all of this to say, the practical, pragmatic skills are directly connected to soft skills. And if you look at any of the research around this, people are much more influenced and spend a lot more time staying up at night worrying about their people problems than the systems or processes in place.
Yeah, so true. And I love that you tackle it head on and that you're out there in the world trying to make those shifts and those reframes. Because I'm like you kind of scratch your head going, how did these become to be seen as a liability? I mean, if you look at almost all the negotiation experts and all the people who are exceptional negotiators, I mean, most academics even agree that it comes down to rapport building, empathy, flexibility, intuition, trust building, and yes, assertiveness. But I think people see that as a so-called masculine trait because they mix it up with aggressive, right? But the other traits are all traits that people would ironically call soft skills,
Right.
and yet don't associate them with expertise in negotiation. It's this bizarre contradiction. So
Exactly.
I'd love to hear about your model a bit. I know you've got a signature model about that trust and credibility, because I agree with you. I think people do make very quick decisions. So what are some things people can do to help with that?
Yes, exactly. Well, it's called the negotiation equation, and it is really based on confidence, connection, and clarity.
Mm.
So those are all generic terms. I recognize that I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth. So the first thing that I want to say when we look at confidence, again, lots of different ways that we can measure this, but one of the ways that I think about this is, let's talk about the handshake moment, for example.
Mm.
We all know that moment, and the way we shake someone's hand and whether we look them in the eye or not can make a massive difference right then and there. And that's one of many ways that we can demonstrate confidence.
Yeah.
And then if we look at our voice, being able to speak with confidence, and I think now would be a good time to talk about upspeak, since we're talking about voice, if that works for you.
Absolutely.
That it's fascinating to me. So first of all, I think it's important for everybody to be on the same page of when we say upspeak or uptalk, it's the slang term for when we end a statement with a question mark or a comma. And I'll model this because I think it's really helpful for people to hear it and recognize that most people, all genders, do this when they introduce themselves. So for example, here's the typical way. Hi, I'm Karen Laos, and I'm originally from Minneapolis, but now I live in San Francisco. Versus, hi, I'm Karen Laos. I'm originally from Minneapolis, but now I live in San Francisco.
It's so good.
And all I'm doing is punctuating. That's
Yeah.
what I think is so funny. But when the spoken word somehow has forgotten punctuation, and yet when we write an email, we wouldn't think twice about putting a period or a comma or a question mark when it's appropriate.
Yeah.
So all we're doing, if we punctuate when we speak, and I always joke with people, the one thing you should be an expert on is your name.
Yeah.
Yet,
It should not be a question.
I was speaking at a networking event a couple of weeks ago, and 30 women introduced themselves first. They had 30 seconds to share their elevator pitch. Not one of them said their name or what they do with the period.
Wow.
Because it would be things like, I'm Karen Laos, I'm a communication expert.
Yeah.
And then you go, wait, it's hard to believe it then. So that vocal conviction is so critical, and it directly maps to confidence and credibility.
Yeah.
So if you want more credibility, speak with that conviction. And that's also how people decide very quickly if they think that you're worth listening to. Because if we think about this in leadership in general, business ownership, CEOs, whatever title you want to call yourself or are, but if we are not speaking with conviction, then it feels like this person isn't leading me anywhere. And I know for me, I always tell people, I think I'm the nicest and most respectful person that wants to make sure everybody's seen and heard. But if I feel like someone is not taking control, I will tend to interject.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the handshake. I think we often forget that, right? Or people see it as dated and nobody bothers to make sure that that's something they're aware of. Because I can't tell you how many people I've interviewed who give that sort of wet noodle kind of, and it's an immediate like, oh, okay. Because rightly or wrongly, we do immediately associate that with a lack of confidence. So I totally hear you. Any other tips on that about how to build that trust and credibility quick? People are judging us quickly. So you've mentioned about smiling, making sure you punctuate, with that confidence. What are some other ways you can do that?
Yeah, one of the things is to simply have good posture. And I think about this, one of my stories way back when, and when I was 18 years old, I took Arthur Murray dance classes.
Wow. Yeah.
And I remember walking into the studio one day and somebody thought I was an instructor. And I was so taken aback. And I said, oh my gosh, no, I'm a student here. But I did ask, what made you think I was an instructor? And he said, well, you walked in with so much confidence.
Yeah.
And this is such a great example of how to command or own a space. And one of my simple hacks for trying to get to use the bathroom in a public in a public place. This is totally an aside. But when you walk into a restaurant with confidence, oh, could you tell me where the bathroom is? Even if you're not eating there. Now, I'm not trying to say that I'm hacking all the time, but I do think that there is something so different versus someone coming in, hi, I know I didn't eat here, but is it possible, that I could potentially use the bathroom?
Yes.
Such a different experience.
It's so true. And even you'd mentioned about traveling, because I have that same experience where if you get the room that you don't like, or you didn't get the bed that you asked for, whatever. And again, I've noticed time and again, what a role confidence plays, even in that. People who are come down really tentatively and apologetically, they don't get the swapped upgraded room, right? They don't, but when you show up with confidence, and it doesn't matter how many times they say, I'm sorry, Ms. Watson, we don't have another room. And I'm like, well, I'd like to speak to your manager then, because I'm just, and you just don't take no for an answer. Miraculously, there is always another room, right? So
yes, there is. I'm thinking oh my gosh, I have this flood of stories coming into my brain. I'm remembering a specific time when I was at Caesar's Palace in Atlantic City, and I was speaking there, and I made the mistake of using the kiosk, which I'm not a big fan of, even though I know it's a time saver, but I ended up in this room right on top of the parking garage. And I thought, I am here. I could potentially have an ocean view. I called, and it was the funniest interaction. They said, well, we don't have rooms to switch for that reason. I said, what? Oh, so you just told me you didn't have rooms. Now you're saying you don't have rooms for that reason. I hung up, went downstairs, ended up getting a oceanfront room. But what the compromise was, because I also think it's always important when you're asking for something, you have to also recognize that there are things you may have to compromise. It's not like the red carpet is rolled out every time we ask. But she said, I am happy to give you an oceanfront room, but those rooms are not remodeled. Do you care about that? And I said, no, I don't. I'd rather have the ocean view. Yeah. So that's something I've always thought was important to remember with these things that I teach as well.
Yeah, I like that compromise, that concession piece. And can you tell us what the 3 C's are again, just to really put a pin in that for our audience?
Yes. For the negotiation equation, it's confidence, clarity, and connection. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about confidence. Yeah. Clarity, to bring that home to really tangible again, because those are big words and they mean a lot of things. But clarity, one of the things I love to teach people is how to stop rambling and get to the point. So first of all, starting with having a point. And I have to fully disclose that I am a recovering rambler myself. So I have taught myself, we're right there in good company. But what you do is you notice that you're doing it. First of all, you have to have the emotional intelligence to recognize you're rambling. And then you stop, pause to gather your thoughts, and then say out loud, and my point is this. Yeah. Nice. That will help you focus. It will help the audience or the listeners, whoever is in the room with you, realize, oh, she has a point. And it helps to recalibrate everybody. Yeah. That's one thing. And then definitely be careful about data dumping on people without getting to your point first. Yeah. I'm amazed at how many people, I'm confident you've seen this as well, start with all this detail. Yeah. And you're going, I don't know what this means. What
no context. Yeah.
There's no context. There's nothing to attach it to. And so thinking about having an anchor at the beginning of a message, even something as simple as, I know most people aren't even leaving voicemails anymore, but I think we can mostly relate to the voicemail where somebody calls and they're talking. And then at the end they say, oh, and my point is this. Yeah. Here's the reason I called. So I notice a lot with human beings that we're wired to build a case and then give the punchline. And we need to remember that the way we take in information is to have the point or the punchline first, and then all of those details will make sense. Yeah.
Well, and you just nailed it when you said about building a case, because I think that's really what it comes down to. And again, I want to really put a pin in that for our listeners and our viewers out there, because I think we do have a tendency, our human condition is we want to make the argument. We want to sell the idea first, right? We want to build that before the person even has the context to know what the ask is, right? It's like we feel the need to justify our ask before we make the ask. So exactly. I totally agree. Give that context first, then back it up if you need to. And frankly, even better, get curious to find out what the other party's needs are as well, right? Before. So I love that. I love that.
Well, I have to say that's a good reminder. I always tell people, and I do my best to do this as well, at the beginning of any call, asking the person, what would give you the most value out of our time today?
Yes.
Or what is the reason? I mean, I had a CEO who I had to ask 3 times in a half an hour call, and he never quite got to what
Wow.
this was.
Wow. Wow. I
And
love that.
I think he just wanted to tell me about the client that because I'm coaching one of his C-suite people. And I remember going, I can't believe, first of all, I didn't know why we were meeting and I'd been coaching her for months, and then he wanted to meet all of a sudden. So of course you get this thing of, am I not
Yeah.
doing a good job or what? And he just could not tell me.
Okay.
I
Well,
said, let's circle back. And anyhow,
and no,
you're
no wonder she needed coaching if that was the modeling she was getting, right? Like, good grief. So,
welcome.
and the other point I'd make about that, because I think clarity is so often overlooked. We tend to wing it. We assume things are just going to flow, but preparation is so important, and getting clarity around what you want has got to be a big part of that preparation process. And not just about the what you want, but also the relationship outcomes you want, which I don't know about you, Karen, but I find that so often forgotten, right? Like sometimes the relationship is more important than the thing that you are negotiating over, and getting clarity around all of those elements so important in my view.
Very, very true. Yeah, I totally agree. And I will say the third, so everybody's on the same page.
Yes.
And the third one is connection.
Yeah.
And that's really where being able to, again, from an emotional intelligence perspective, being able to read the room, but first having that eye contact so that people feel it, whether it's on a virtual call where you need to look at the webcam, or
Yeah.
on my computer just an inch below the webcam, or a centimeter. And really being aware of that connection, asking questions, and then pausing long enough to listen. So if we have these 3, that connection, clarity, and confidence, that's going to help us be much more prepared to have the best negotiation we can.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that. And when we're speaking about connection, I'd like your thoughts, because one of the things that you're hearing so much about today, and I kind of go, oh, I'm not sure that's great advice, especially for a novice, is about the mirroring and matching, which I totally agree can be very important. But the advice they're getting is if somebody leans in. If they cross their arms, cross it, like it takes a certain level of skill and practice to be able to do that with the ease and subtlety to make the kind of connection. And if you don't have that practice or skill set developed yet, it's more likely to break rapport. Better to focus on your pacing, your tone of voice, on those kinds of things to make connection. Those are my views. I'd love your perspective on that, though. I may be biased.
Oh, I'm right there with you. I don't teach mirroring specifically because I think it can come across as manufactured.
Yeah.
And then we get more fixated on trying to be something for someone, and then we don't often even think about what they're saying.
Yeah.
So to me, the way that I would first coach anyone is to be more aware of your own behaviors and how you come across in meetings or presenting, and record yourself and watch it back.
Yeah.
That to me is the ultimate objective reality of how you're coming across, and then hire a coach or a friend even to watch it with you.
Yeah.
And then in the moment, it's really being able to watch the cues. And sure, the way that I look at it is beware of being extreme. So for example, I'll give you an example. When I started in my corporate training career, this is now 20 some years ago. I remember, or 25 probably. I remember coming in with tons of energy, and it was a group of 12 male engineers. And I was probably, when I look back, it's one of those times, sometimes I'd like to have a video of my life and see other people's reactions outside of
Yeah.
because that was a time where I should have toned it down.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm so guilty. Yeah. What's interesting for me? My learning point on that, I think, was my daughter, because I tend to be extroverted when I'm speaking about something that I'm passionate about. I speak quickly. I'm really energized, and much like you described going into that. And my daughter is not. As an introvert, I learned some valuable lessons about slowing down, right? Watching my tone and my pacing, because otherwise it's very off-putting for somebody. So I love that advice, Karen, about watch the cues and the reactions from the party that you're dealing with, right? Because no
Mhm.
matter how great your content is, if there's no connection there and they're not receiving, then you're going up against a brick wall. And I love the idea when you said about, because to me, so much of the advice out there now, people get so much in their head, right? As you were alluding to, it's like,
I
okay,
know.
I'm supposed to cross my arms. And then they come across as totally inauthentic, which
Yes.
breaks the very connection that you're talking about fostering.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I have a past colleague who started a company called Talk Like a Person. And I love that. She and I both used to work together and taught communication skills. And that name is so plain spoken. It's beautiful
I
because
really like
everybody
it.
gets it. And that's unfortunately what happens oftentimes, where people become this presenter mode version of themselves, where it's, oh, now I'm presenting and
Yeah.
everybody, and it breaks the credibility, because when you're used to them being a certain way, their authentic
Yeah.
selves, and then they suddenly become this performer or robotic version of themselves. It's a weird shift. It's kind of like somebody said something earlier today about cognitive load. It
Yeah.
takes too much of a cognitive load, and if we have to burn too many calories to figure out what
Yeah.
people are doing,
Yeah.
we tune them out.
Yeah. And you're right about that presenter's voice. And I think we're almost conditioned to that too. Like even growing up, the newscasters, there's a certain tone,
Yes.
right? The radio personalities, it was always, and they weren't talking like a human. It was a very, I don't know, it came across as inauthentic or posture, but most of us, when we present, believe that's the way you need to show up. So that's super advice. Now, I saw
Well,
somewhere that you advocate about 9 words to avoid and what to say instead. And that really piqued my interest. I'd love if you could share those with us.
yes, absolutely. Well, I'll share a sampling and you can get all of them for free on my website if you'd like.
Perfect.
But there's two, and I'll model this in a sentence because I feel like it's important to remember basically what words are we using that are modifying the strength of our language. So
Yeah.
for example, the words just and little
Yeah.
are sometimes put together in a sentence. For example, I might say to you, I just want to share a little tip.
Yeah.
Versus, I want to share a tip.
Yes.
It takes away, first of all, I love the term, every word has a job.
Yeah.
If you take those words out of it, it doesn't change the meaning and it actually makes it stronger. And most importantly, besides the language itself, it makes you look more confident and credible.
Yeah.
So those are two of my favorites. And obviously they're both in the English language for a reason. So things like, I just saw Cindy across the street. I mean, that would make sense. I just saw you. I just hung up the phone. But to say things like, I just wanted to update you. And I find it's a really helpful action step to go when you're writing an email. And that's where you can start editing those out. It's harder to edit with your spoken word because it's coming out of you. I mean, that's where recording yourself is so helpful, but starting with email can be really, really useful.
And even
For
just
sure.
raising your awareness about it. So that I love
Yes.
that you're putting that out there in the universe. And as you said that, I was thinking of, I find women tend to be more guilty of that, especially vis-a-vis their accomplishments. They trivialize them. We diminish them, right? By saying, oh, I just got this. Like recently, I was at an event with a woman and she was talking about, she won some quite significant literary award, right? She was selected as one of the top, and she didn't get the first prize, but she was like one of the top 3 runners up. And she's like, oh, well, I just got whatever. And I'm like, Barb, I don't want to hear the word just come out of your mouth again when you are describing an accolade that you just got, right? And she's like, oh, that's true, right? So just raising our awareness. I love that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, I'll say the other one that is very common, and it's especially common for women, but I see it in all genders, and it's I'm sorry, the over apologizing.
oh,
So
go ahead. Sorry.
my no need to be sorry.
Yes. See, I'm doubly challenged as a Canadian woman. We apologize for everything. You bump into me, I'm likely to say sorry.
It's funny you say that. Yeah, I do see that is funny when we go even deeper into cultures, for sure. But I would suggest training ourselves to say, excuse me, instead as your default response.
Yeah.
But then a very specific response to things like you're running behind or you're, whatever it is, saying thank you for your patience or I
Absolutely.
appreciate your understanding. And that is so much better as far as like we don't need to apologize unless we have legitimately wronged someone.
Yes.
To your point about bumping into people, I remember being at a grocery store a few months ago, and three of us bumped into each other in one aisle, and everybody said, "I'm sorry."
Well, and I love for our listeners there. I think this is great advice you're getting on that, because we do tend to over apologize. And there have been some studies on that where we assume that that will create a better connection, but it actually increases, it triggers an increased cortisol reaction in the person who's being apologized to, because subconsciously they assume that you just did some wrong to them. So you may not be doing a favor to the other person when you apologize. I found that very interesting. That
I have not heard that. That brings science into it. That's
yes, yeah.
amazing. Thank you. Ooh, love
Yeah.
that.
So I challenge all of you to go on an apology fast. It was, Dr. Aziz had, that was the first time I had heard that. He had recommended, he's a confidence coach, and he had talked about taking an apology fast where you really raise your awareness about how often you're apologizing in a day. If you're like most people, it was a shock to me when I started tallying up the number of times I said sorry. It's incredible. So Karen,
Well, and I have to say one other thing to train
yeah,
yourself to say this is more of a fun thing on the side. Say
yeah.
this to yourself, perhaps. Say I'm sexy instead.
Oh, I like that. I like that. That is getting two for the price of one, because you're building your confidence at the same time that you're stopping diminishing. That is so good. Now, you have a fear script exercise, I believe, to help
Yes,
eliminate
I
self-doubt.
do.
What is that about?
Yeah. The idea is it truly is a script, and you start with your strongest message of doubt. You write that out. So it might be as simple as I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
Or if it's for a specific thing, I'm nervous about giving this talk, for example. And then ask yourself, well, what would my higher self say back to that? And it might be something like, you're absolutely good enough. And here's
Yeah.
all of the reasons why, not that you need a reason, but it's what I find so interesting about it is that when you start, it seems like, because of course it's coming out of ourselves, that it feels like that's all the same. And yet when we separate it, it's amazing how much cleaner it is to go, oh, I'm actually not the fear.
Yeah.
It doesn't. And so I find it fascinating that people can immediately recognize that their higher self knows what to say,
Yeah. That's good.
even though it doesn't seem like that would be possible, because you think,
Yeah.
oh, wow. And then we don't have to go into all this detail, but I remember I've learned that it's something around narrative therapy,
Yeah.
which I'm not a therapist for
Yeah.
sure. But I find that really interesting that, oh, that's why this works so well, because it's like you're narrating someone else's story in a
Yeah.
sense.
And you know what I love about that? It's such a simple model, right? And sometimes the most effective models are really at some level common sense, and yet we don't do it because all of our conditioning is being the opposite. So that is
Yeah.
brilliant.
Another exercise that I find really fun is called the Broadway musical exercise. And this is about the self-doubt. So
Yeah.
let's take that same message. I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
Notice even when we say those out loud, like you can hear my energy is lower,
Yes. It
sounds
drops.
heavy.
Yeah.
But if I sing it like a Broadway musical and say, I'm not good enough,
Oh, that's good.
we laugh, it's, it makes it light, it's sort of funny. And from a neuroscience perspective, it changes up the neural pathways in our brains, which
Yes.
means that it takes the power away from that same message.
I have not heard that one before. That is definitely something I'm going to put in my arsenal. That is so good. And again,
Yay.
so simple and fun. That is so
Yes,
great. I love
yes.
it.
Well, that came from Rachel Grant, who is a friend of mine and a coach as well. So
Yeah.
she's brilliant, and I've been using that a lot because it's
Yeah.
so simple, to your point about simplicity.
Yeah. And what a great thing to teach kids like this. So much of this, imagine what a different world it would be if we put this in the curriculum, starting from really like elementary school kids, about the apologies, about those simple ways to, have them start creating brag lists from the time they're in grade 1. I mean, it would be a very different world with more
Yes.
empowered people. Now, you've done a lot of pretty high profile corporate training. So what do you find are some of the key problems with communication in the workplace? Because I know you're a communications expert.
Yeah, well, I find that similar to things that we have talked about, for example, it's amazing how the highest level people I find are still rambling, still have a hard time getting to the point, and have a hard time saying what they need.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
working with a CEO of a large corporation, And it was a really interesting experiment. And I didn't intend it to be an experiment. But what happened was he paid for a whole day to work with me on his presence and all of that. So the way that I typically run those days is I start with an interview about the person, just casually, how would you describe yourself?
Yeah.
And a little bit more. And then we go to lunch and everything. One of the things that I noticed is that, well, two things. One, he didn't ask me one question about myself the entire day.
Yeah.
And I don't need someone, I don't need to be heard by this guy. Like that was not something
Yeah.
I needed. But I made the observation after lunch because I wanted to give him a chance at lunch to think,
Yeah.
well, maybe, and nothing.
Wow.
And so when I talked to him about so this is, I'm making 2 points here just to
Yeah.
clarify for everybody. One, in this specific case, is the simplicity of asking a question to someone.
Yeah.
Pausing long enough. So I see that as a problem all the time. People want to be heard, so they're sharing their opinion. We feel like we need to or want to be right. So we're always and we're natural problem solvers. So it's a natural thing to keep talking, giving advice, and we're self-focused by nature.
Yeah.
So asking that question can make a huge difference. And then the second problem that I see is the same thing with this guy is that he could not give me the point of his message. That's what we worked on all afternoon.
Yep.
He said, I'm meeting, and it was a company where he was in the news a lot. And he said, I'm trying to get better at my message. And I said, well, what is the point? You're telling me all this detail, but I still don't know why you're telling me all this detail.
Yeah.
So what I find fascinating too, that the higher levels I work with, the whatever clout a
Yep.
company or person has, it does not matter. At the end of the day, we are all human beings. We all have the same problems.
Yeah. And curiosity. I'm glad you come back to keep coming, sort of circling back that thread, because I think it is one of the most underrated skills in communication and effective negotiation for that matter. We are a very ego-driven kind of society. We're conditioned that way. And, I call it the art of fascination when we can show up and start asking questions, especially if you see somebody's triggered, rather than backing up, like lean into that and I see I've said something that's really seems to have caused a reaction. Let's talk about that. Tell me a bit about what's happening right now. How can we move past this? So just being able to really get curious as opposed to feeling like if you're talking the most in a negotiation, chances are it's time to stop, drop, and roll and flip the script, right? Allow them to do some talking. So now, what do you feel are some of the hallmarks, I guess you would say, to a great negotiator?
Oh, wow. Well, similar to what we just talked about, curiosity. And I would add the listening, then pausing long enough to listen.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I find is people but they're not clear on what they want, in part because they don't know what they want.
Yeah.
They know they want to negotiate, but they're not clear on what they're asking for.
Yeah.
I also find, I love the story from the book Stephen Covey wrote, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And the story that I have been, it was so memorable to me as a young person when I first read that book about there were 2 different people working in an office setting. And one of them was annoyed that the other guy had the window open. And it was all about the window. Like, why can't you close the window? Oh, because I need the window open. And when they actually talked about it, they found out why the guy wanted the window open was because he liked fresh air.
Yeah.
And the other person wanted the window closed because he didn't like drafts. He didn't mind the fresh air. So then they came up with a solution to open a window in another room.
Yes. Yes. So as I say, it's that curiosity, and we're so taught to hold our cards close to our chest that I think
Right.
sadly so many negotiators, and some of whom believe they're quite skilled, end up never having the discussion that would actually allow them to find the better solution that's sitting right there on the table if they would just allow themselves to explore it. So
Yes.
yes.
Well, and I think also so many people look at negotiation as a win-lose scenario.
Oh,
And that's another thing that to me is so critical, is seeing it as it can be a win-win.
yeah.
And if we are looking out for the other party as well as ourselves, and are we good at communicating the value for whatever we are attempting to negotiate?
Yeah.
What is underneath that? And I feel like that's what people miss a lot, is this theme that we're talking about right now is about being curious and listening
Yeah.
long enough to understand. And if going back to Stephen Covey, one of his principles of seek first to understand,
Yeah.
if we can start there,
Yeah.
we can accomplish so much more in a negotiation. I mean, this happens with me related to my negotiation with clients all the time. When I start with, what do you need? What is the problem that you need to solve? People are so quick to say, well, what is your fee?
Yeah.
Well, let's start with
Yes.
like, what are you looking for? Why me?
Yeah.
What is it? Asking all these questions to engage in a conversation to then help them. I might not even be the solution to their problem. It might be somebody else.
Yeah. And I love that you really drew that distinction about win-win. I think so often that it has to take into account what the other party truly wants, the unstated needs as well as the stated. And I've had, like through my law practice, really experienced, well-known mediators, professional mediators who go, I know I've done my job well if everybody walks away unhappy. I don't know about you, that infuriates me because it's like, that
Yeah.
is not a win-win. It's about winning better, finding even more creative
Mhm.
solutions than we thought we had come to the table with. So splitting the baby is not necessarily a win-win, right? So I hear you.
Exactly. And I have gotten that. I love that you use the word creative, because I have gotten complimented on that more than once with my corporate contracts of, wow, I love the fact that you're willing to be creative with pricing or what have you. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that when we get so fixated on it has to be this one way, that's when we lose out, because we might find that in the conversation that there is a whole other possibility that
Yeah,
we weren't
totally.
even thinking about.
Yeah, that's better than either of us had hoped to get. It's I
Exactly.
often say, I come thinking I want X, you want Y. If we hold our cards close to the chest and do the traditional model, I'm going to be fighting for X, you're going to be fighting for Y. We might give a little bit, both of us get whatever, as opposed to having full discussion where we realize, oh, it's not about the price of the truck. It's the fact that you actually are going to be moving away and you have a whole business and I could give you a kickback from that. That is a way better solution than what either of us originally thought we were talking about here. I just,
Yeah,
so important.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
sure.
there's a couple more C's for you to add, right? Creativity is
I know.
curiosity. You can have
Well,
the 5C system now.
it is funny you say that, because I have the 7 C's to communicate with confidence. I have so many C's. I'm like,
Nice.
can't keep up.
Awesome. Awesome. I can't believe how fast our time's gone. I normally like to end by asking, what is one of the greatest mindset shifts you've ever had? Doesn't have to be on this issue. It can be totally unrelated, but an aha moment that made you see things differently.
Yeah, it's when when I got to the punchline is when I got the first draft from my ghostwriter initially, when I thought I was going to hire a ghostwriter and he didn't even get the point of my book. And I promptly fired him and realized in that moment, I'm going to have to write the book myself. But the moment was, I was driving to the gym and I was really upset because I had already paid him a lot of money. And I remember thinking, that guy didn't even get the point of my book.
Yeah.
And then I had to turn to myself and say, what is the point of your book?
Oh.
And right away, it was so funny. I was having this whole dialogue with myself and I said, it's about trusting your own voice. And the irony is that I was planning to hire a ghostwriter to write the book. So God had other plans for me to do it. But that was a huge aha for me, because it also made me realize I probably was not as good at communicating it. I have had this tradition of looking to other people, and that's how I was raised, that everybody else knows more than me. And so still fighting with those voices occasionally, but recognizing that when we can trust our own voice, and the fact that I could write a book to help other people, hopefully not just be inspired by it, but practical tips to take action as a guidebook for their communication skills. That is really my heart, that people can have practical, actionable skills that they can use every day.
Thank you for sharing that, Karen, because I think one of the things that really underscores for me, and I hope our listeners caught that, this is an ongoing process. We're constantly learning and growing. I mean, I'm out there as a negotiation consultant and coach. And yet there are moments where, whether with my intimate partner or my kids, or things come up and I'm like, Oh my gosh, I was so not my best self, right? And just having to reinforce and
Yeah.
remind yourself. So where can people learn more about you, Karen? Where should they
They
go?
can go to my website, which is karenlaos.com, and that's KarenLaos.com.
And we will make sure to put that in the show notes, as well as a reference to Karen's book. I encourage you to go get a copy, check it out. These are incredibly valuable life skills that we are just not taught, or to the extent that we think we're taught, a lot of it is based on myths and misconceptions. So definitely check that out. And thank you so much for sharing your incredible insights with us, Karen. This has been a great, fun conversation.
Oh, it has been great. Absolutely. Well, the other thing I wanted to say is that I post short videos on Instagram a lot too. So Karen Laos Official, you can find that on my website, but it hit me that, oh yeah, there's a lot of tips that I offer there for people that love to watch videos that are 15 to 30 seconds long.
Oh, I love that. And we'll make sure to post all the socials. So check those out, how you get your daily little inspiration to help set you on the right path every day. And I'm sure you've all just got tons of value from this episode. If you were listening at all, you had to have. There were all kinds of gold nuggets here. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that already. And make sure to share this episode with anyone that you think could get value from the message. And since, I often say all of life is a negotiation, at its core, it's all about communication. And there have been some real gems here today that can help up-level your skills. So make sure to share that. And who couldn't benefit from this approach to life? And also make sure to grab a copy of my book, The Art of Feminine Negotiation, How to Get What You Want from the Boardroom to the Bedroom, if you haven't done that already. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.